This is Questions of Courage, a podcast from the youth section at the Goetheanum, hosted by Nathaniel Williams.
Welcome to Questions of Courage. Today I'd like to speak about something that may seem on the face of it not to have much to do with some of the tensions and pressures that we are experiencing around the world in relationship to environmental pressures, ecological pressures, economic pressures, and in a tangential way or less clear way with problems of nationalism and competition. But I'm convinced that they are deeply connected with these things. And in an earlier episode, I spoke briefly about the idea of the revolution of common sense that's being imagined and pursued in the United States and in other places in the world, often associated with really strong nationalism, economic competition, imperialism even. I don't want to just turn towards that and criticize it, but I want to describe another perspective, which I already indicated, but give a little bit more body to it. And in beginning, I admit, it's going to seem very unlikely. And it's because I'd like to speak about aesthetic education. And that really feels like it's coming from left field. Because aesthetic, the way we use it commonly, is associated with beauty and art. And what beauty and art are supposed to have to do with ecology and economics or nationalism will seem pretty obscure on the face of it. Yes, that's a given. And that's where it gets exciting. Because there's a whole deeper field of possibility that is not only theoretical, but it's already been developed. And it's had a great influence as well. Whether we know it or not, it played a role in the emergence of the environmental movement, which I'll say a little bit more about at the end of this episode. So, first of all, aesthetic was introduced in the 18th century, and the term was chosen not because it was narrowly associated with beauty or art, but it was chosen by Alexander Baumgarten because it had been a term that was used to express knowledge gained through experience or gained through the senses. And it was opposed or complementary to, depending on the thinker, logic. So aesthetic had to do with being able to develop knowledge through perception, through experience, and not just through reason, rationality, and logic. Now, the way that it became narrowly focused on art and beauty, I'm not going to go into today. That was largely connected with the work of Immanuel Kant and, to some extent, Friedrich Schiller. I would just like to try to present in an outline form how limited our conception is of aesthetic education and to at least point towards the implications that are connected with that and the hope and the inspiration that one can rightfully feel in thinking about an aesthetic culture that is not so one-sided, not so narrowly focused on art and beauty. And I'm going to do so by referring to Goethe. Now, Goethe is one of the most famous and influential playwrights and poets of history, and rightfully so. Many people don't even know that he developed a significant portion of his creative energy and intelligence and his life to natural science. And it's not so much the outcomes of his research that I want to focus on today, but on the form, on the method. Again, I also don't want to suggest that this is just an observation of historical relevance. By the end of the episode, I hope to be able to just point towards the contemporary influence, and also with that, real reasons for hope. So how is it that one could approach natural science and consider it a part of aesthetic education? Well, I'm not going to be referring to Baumgarten, but to Goethe. And Goethe actually developed an idea, and not only that, but examples of how to do research according to a method that he called intuitive understanding. Now, in English, that actually sounds speculative, like maybe even abstract, but it's, as you'll see, totally intertwined with direct sense experience, perception, to the point where you can't really separate it from perception, from experience, from observation. What is this method that Goethe developed? Well, Goethe set out, for instance, in his research into color and optics, but also in his botanical research, to observe. To observe very carefully, high degree of loyalty and fidelity, and yet at the same time to be as active inwardly and to participate as fully in the observations as possible. And he didn't strive to, for instance, develop a theory out of a few observations. In fact, he tried to suppress all of the activity of speculation and theorizing as he made observations, and he designed new experiments and made new observations. There is something that is important to consider when we're talking about Goethe, which is how he experienced theory or ideas in relationship to perception. And really the guiding star for him was the experience of writing a poem or creating a piece of art. And he knew this very well, as anyone can see who opens up a work of his poetry or one of his plays. And he experienced how a poem or a play grows out of a creative process. And in this creative process, every part is somehow connected, and eventually it comes into clear form and specificity and particularity, and is something that one can encounter as a perception, as an experience. But it starts out as a creative process, as something that is an inspiration. And this, for Goethe, was his orientation when he looked towards nature. When he saw, for instance, a plant, or when he saw the rainbow, he had this orientation that underneath every apparent separate perception, there was a creative process that connected it with everything else. And he really felt this as if nature was imbued with the kind of creativity that we experience when we're creative artistically. And this is his point of departure. So the creative ideas are the creative forces that bring about everything we perceive and everything we experience. And he felt like he could access these creative activities through observing and perceiving, being very loyal to what he perceived and what he observed, but feeling as if there's a creative activity connected with every observation. And so the world, in a way, appeared for him and all of nature, and also people and animals and the stars, as an expression that ultimately needed to be looked at as an expression of creative, spiritual activity or inspiration, spiritual inspiration, and that we could understand if we approached it in the right way. But this is really just the foreword. This is just the preface of what he developed as a method. This would just be a kind of, romanticism of nature philosophy if it didn't develop into more particular and mature kind of approach to research. But Goethe did develop it further. And what he did is he imagined, now, for instance, in the case of color, if the whole world of color is connected with one creative, inspired activity, one expresses one interconnected lawfulness of a creative idea, then if I can observe all the different ways that color appears, if I can make experiments and observations, and I can never be satisfied with one experiment, but alter the conditions and see how color appears and emerges when the conditions are altered, sometimes in the totally opposite way. Only if I get an overview of all the expressions of color could I see in all of those appearances the creative, unified idea that is determining them. And so Goethe's color theory, for instance, if you take it and you look at it, there are experiments after experiments, and they're ordered in a very particular way. And they're very easy to do at home, and you can do most of them with simple materials in your own house. And this huge variety of observations is laid out. And then at the end, Goethe arrives not at a kind of theoretical, logical idea, but he arrives at something that he calls the primal phenomenon. Now, this is something that is so interesting because one of the things it points towards is a huge difference between the normal way philosophers approach things and Goethe. And the normal way philosophers approach things, even today, I'd like to say, is Platonic. An idea exists that can explain the phenomena, and the idea can be discussed independent of the phenomena or observations. For Goethe, this was not a possibility. Everything in him, he definitely sensed the generative, creative idea, but to imagine that you could separate it from its creative body, its expression, which is the world, that was a painful imagination. And this expresses itself even in the way that he concludes, for instance, his color theory, when he doesn't present an idea that you can think about that's supposed to explain all color theory, but he actually describes the primal phenomenon, which, for those of you who are not familiar with it, has to do with the relationship between a light source, darkness, and some form of opaque material or medium, turbidity, dust, mist, and that with these three perceptible elements, there's a way to feel like you can understand the whole great world of color experience. So in the end, for Goethe, at the end of his science, there's not a theory that in ideas that explains experience, but there's an experience that somehow works as an illuminating light source over other experiences. At all points, Goethe is firmly connected with the foundations of the phenomenal world, with nature, and he doesn't dissociate from that in order to reach truth. So now I've described that Goethe experienced natural science ultimately from a perspective that phenomenon should be approached as the expressions of creative activity, and that there were creative ideas connected with them. 1. 2, he proceeded through an aesthetic orientation, which is to gain as much perception and experience as possible to build up his understanding. 3, the result of his natural scientific investigations itself was aesthetic, meaning it was a phenomena. At the same time, this phenomena is experienced as an idea. And now I'd like to proceed to the last characteristic, which clearly situates this as a part of aesthetic education, which is that it helps us to develop certain feelings, that it actually educates our feeling life. And this is not something that is usually associated with natural science, which I'm going to say one word about in a moment. But first, back to Goethe. After this huge effort at investigation and all of these observations, Goethe comes to the primal phenomenon, which is perception and explanation at the same time. And then he describes in different places the feelings that are connected with this experience. You experience a kind of elevation when you look at this phenomena after having gone through the whole sequence of observations. But you also experience it as a kind of limit. You experience a kind of resignation at the limits and the structures of the phenomenal world. Now, this is very different from a resignation, Goethe points out, which would have to do with my subjectivity, which would have to do with my subjective limits. This is a kind of cosmic resignation across from the phenomenal world. In front of the primal phenomenon, there's a feeling of awe, of a kind of acceptance of something that is given and that is not to be altered, and resignation. Another thing that he describes is how it inspires fear. It inspires fear in us when we're in the presence of these primal phenomena that you can't get behind. At the end of the day, these are the most simple examples of a play of relationships that you access through natural science. And there's a kind of fear in front of them, an awe and fear. And he says only the eternal play of empirical experience can bring us our joy back. But there's also a kind of stability. There's a kind of feeling of being supported and carried that emerges through practicing this type of natural scientific observation and investigation. And in the end, he tries to describe the strange intersections in the primal phenomenon. It is ideal, he says. It's the last thing recognizable. It is real. We recognize it. It is symbolic because it explains all cases. And it is identical with all cases. Now, this is an aesthetic experience. This is not the aesthetic experience of beauty. This is an aesthetic experience which is particularly connected with what I would like to characterize as aesthetic education in the natural sciences. Now, it turns out that this is not the type of science that we have today. And I think that a lot of the characterizations of natural science that we have today are very accurate in many ways. It's focused on creating theories, associating these theories, which are often very functional, often quantitative concepts or logical concepts, and then associating them with particular elements or phenomenon, and then trying to design experiments where we can see through calculation and formal math that we can either verify our theory or falsify our theory. Now, if we verify it, then what we think logically also controls the phenomenal outcome in an experiment. And so it's a kind of creating rational theories and then testing them if they can predict certain situations through experiments, and feeling actually success when we're able to control phenomena. And there are many descriptions of the values that this kind of an approach inspires in our hearts or in our feeling. It's a kind of knowledge practice or philosophical orientation that really tends towards values of control, of efficiency, and of organization and interconnection. This is a very different approach to natural science. One could say we have a natural science that is mostly anesthetic, not aesthetic. And why would this be pertinent when we return to the revolution of common sense that I opened with, the spread of a kind of revolution of common sense that focuses on nationalism, that focuses on economic competition and economic development at the cost, or at least without regard to, ecological foundation of the economy. And here it's interesting just to note that the places where this form of natural science was celebrated, was cultivated, was pursued, one of the only places was in the anthroposophical movement, and largely thanks to Rudolf Steiner and many of his colleagues who dedicated themselves to developing Goethean science. And maybe this can help us understand how it was that Rachel Carson, before she wrote Silent Spring, had a voluminous correspondence with a biodynamic farmer by the name, or gardener by the name of Marjorie Spock, who was litigating against the use of DDT. Maybe this can help us to understand how it could come to be that one of the expert witnesses in the cases that was brought, in this case, was Ehrenfried Pfeiffer, one of the students of Rudolf Steiner, a Goethean scientist, and one of the people that was influential at the moment of the emergence of the environmental movement. This hidden stream of common sense, of an aesthetic, natural, scientific culture that already was developed by Goethe, but has certainly not disappeared. That there's an epistemic community or community of researchers. I have some colleagues here at the natural science section at the Goetheanum dedicated to exactly this type of research that sees ultimately there's a need to connect our knowledge to our experience, to allow the phenomenal world to educate our sensibilities, to have awe and respect for the limits of the phenomenal world, and that this could somehow be connected to our ability to perceive the limits of the environment and its connection maybe with economics, or at least it could support a little bit more common sense for everyone who lives on the earth. This is Questions of Courage. It's a very simple production. Your contributions are very much appreciated and they will support youth work.